Hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Warp Core podcast, a branch of the Digital Escape podcast. I am Urza Master, my co-host Lord Uther. How you doing today?
Fantastic. Ready to talk some Star Trek, my friend.
All right. So today we are launching this new podcast for all of you, our fans and listeners. And, we've been talking about this for a while, is getting together, doing a Star Trek pod. We're both big time Trekkies. We love Star Wars too, of course, but we we had to figure out where to start because Star Trek is a vast universe. I mean, come on, it's literally takes place in the vast universe.
Yes.
But we could have started the original series. We could have started with like early Roddenberry works or wherever, but we chose the 1979 classic Star Trek One, the motion picture. Of course, the director's cut, because I don't know about you, Uther, but I think the original cut was almost unwatchable. It wasn't really great the way it was put together. Let's start there. Let's talk about the differences, between the two. Like we've both seen both, I'm sure. We're focusing on the director's cut, but in this case, what did you like about this one over the original?
Well, I think you hit it right on the head, right? There's graphics, special effects issues with the first one, obviously. I might even go so far as to say some of that impacted the pacing of it a little bit. And, you also can't, with today's technology, I think you would struggle to go back and watch it the way it was released back in 79 because our TVs don't want to do that. We'd see too many of those glaring issues that they have with the special effects then. So to see all these upgrades, I think also just puts it in line with what we're seeing now with Star Trek too, with
Yeah,
Star Trek in general.
I think so. I always found it jarring because I think the first time I ever watched the first movie was the director's cut, and it had the next generation ish music. And then I watched the original, and I was like, wow, this is quite different. And you mentioned the pacing, and I think that's probably our first big topic we should talk about because I still feel even the director's cut pacing is long-winded. The thing I noticed about the two, but especially in the original, but the director's cut too, is the very long, drawn-out sequences of orchestral music, especially when in that first part of the movie where they're boarding the Enterprise, and it's like 25 minutes it seems like, where they're just on a shuttle, and it cuts back to Kirk and Scotty, and they're just sort of looking out the window. You see those close-ups of their face, and then you just see like a lot of space and like a little bit of the ship, and then like some random dude doing backflips in a spacesuit, and
Yeah.
it's to me like that. Those long-winded sequences. I think that was a '70s thing, and it was
I
sort
was
of
just
dying.
about to say that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's sort of dying out by the time you get to 1980. So it feels to me like that was the final nail in the coffin, especially in the original with the really bad special effects. Um, and all the time I've always thought this, and I don't know why this pops in my head, but every time I see that sequence, all I can think about is why are there numbers and letters on the outside of these ships? Who's reading that in space? And let alone that, how do they paint that? Is it cast that way in the metal? Like my dad happened to be watching it with me yesterday, and we were talking about that as it was going through. Like, boy, I'd hate to be the guy that has to paint those big numbers. It's just kind of silly. I don't know why.
So I have two takes on that. And my first one lines up exactly with what you said. It was definitely a sci-fi thing of the 70s. Look at Close Encounters. Look at 2001, A Space Odyssey. That music that paces the sweeping views of spaceships, of space in general. Even Star Wars, actually, it does it a little bit with the scroll, but really, if you think about it, I'm wondering if Star Wars, this is funny, this is turning into a Star Wars podcast, but I wonder if that kind of was the cutoff point, even though Star Trek comes out after Star Wars, because Star Wars actually helped Star Trek get made into a movie because they saw the success of it. Anyway, I'm wondering if that sequence where they get right into the fighting helps get rid of these sweeping views of spaceships. But I'm going to piggyback that with this thought. and I see it. I saw it really, really well in the director's cut. You can see the true love that Kirk has for the Enterprise.
Yeah.
He was made for that ship. He loves that ship. It's ingrained in his heart as much as he's ingrained in the warp core of the heart of that Enterprise. I also think that scene was put together to show how much Scotty believes in Kirk, or just the crew believes in Kirk, right? Like Kirk's like, Scotty, we have to have this ready. You don't have 24 hours. And Scotty's like, I'll have it in 12 hours, Captain, right? Like, I can do
Right.
this for you. He puts his hand on Kirk's arm, like, I've got your back. And you're seeing that reestablishment of the crew dynamic with Kirk. No one can do this but Kirk. That's it.
Right.
We know, and even Uhura says it when he gets on the ship and he walks in the bridge real quick. And I know I'm going ahead a little bit, but he walks on, he addresses the crew, and he's like, I'm taking over. I'm going to go down to engineering. And one of the ensigns says, oh, he's something along the lines of, he's taking over now. And Uhura says, our chances of surviving on this mission just doubled.
Yeah.
That's how
And
much they believe in his what he can do.
yeah, and that's that. I mean, it's funny. I was going to bring that point up too, which is just really cool. You can tell we're Trekkies because we think the same shit.
Right.
Um, I there's several points I want to respond to there.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The first, I'll get back to the Kirk taking over part and how they believe in him. But the first noticeable thing is 77 Star Wars really does change the dynamic of those sci-fi big sweeping shots. Like it still has them, but they're faster paced. There's more
Yes.
action. There's more playing out of story and sequence, where this is really more of that long opening credits, long opening establishing shots, you know, telling a story through visual rather than through action or dialogue, which is still, it's still cool. Like I'm not shitting on it too much. Like it gets a little excessive with this movie, but I think it's something that modern cinema kind of forgets to do is really build things without knocking you over the head with it. There's nothing I hate worse than like getting beaten over the head with a message or with a setup or with a long-winded explanation, other than maybe in Lord of the Rings where like it's a very Tolkien thing to like explain everything to you as it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But it paints that picture of the love of the Enterprise, the importance this is to Kirk. You know, a lot of that opening dialogue, the first really half of the movie is about Kirk stepping back into that captain's chair and establishing himself as a relevant character again. The thing about the movie is they don't really explain what's happened between the original series and the movie. It just, there's some assumed things. Kirk gets promoted, some of the crew still in the Enterprise. You know, Dr. McCoy is basically retired. You know, there's all sorts of things that kind of go along that they kind of sort of half-ass explain, because really the focal point, and I would argue that even in the original series, the focal point was always Kirk, where I think Next Generation did a lot of different things, and then future Star Trek shows changed that dynamic. You know, this movie in particular is sort of all about Kirk in the first half, and of course the back half, it's all about Spock, really.
Right.
And I mean, there's other characters getting some interplay there, but it's interesting you bring up that point because it does paint this picture of he's the captain, he's getting reestablished as the Enterprise's commander, and the crew is with him. Like Uhura and God, I want to say George Takei because it's just how you know him these
Sulu.
days.
Yeah.
Sulu, just watched it too. So you know, Sulu and Uhura are right there, and they are so happy to see him. Like it's just on their face. It's incredibly well acted that they are thrilled to see Kirk like they haven't seen him in a long time, and it's just this tremendous change of dynamic because you don't see Kirk right away in the bridge. You see how the bridge is going, and it's kind of chaos. And all of a sudden, there's this unifying feeling that, you know, this renewed confidence in the team. And Scotty has it too when he gets to engineering. Like, you know, he and Decker are working on the warp core, but, you know, Decker's just sort of there, and he's literally in the trenches with his people, which is, you know, a great captain quality. However, as he later steps into that science officer role, he's really kind of playing the role of a science officer. he's working alongside Scotty already. They're kind of
Right.
subverting his character right there, and I thought that was really clever how they played that, because you can tell he's like upset about not being in command. Like they make that kind of plainly obvious in sort of an annoying way. Um, but he has this intimate knowledge of the science of the ship that does come into play later, and he has that. He's capable, but he's not Kirk, and that's why I would say that's what pushes Kirk back into that role and why he ends up being successful. Because the one thing I will say, to shift gears somewhat, is about halfway through the movie I kind of realized like the overall story is really just an episode of Star Trek. It's like a
That's
really long
exactly what it
episode of the
is.
original series. Whereas I think the later movies moving forward really feel more like true movies. Um, and this one is really like, this could have been an episode. Like they could have definitely had this like in a season 4.
Well, it was. This was going to be the pilot for Star Trek Phase 2. And
Mm-hmm.
so they took it and reworked it into, into a movie to bring the characters back. So it's interesting though. It is. It's just a long episode of Star Trek, but that's why, and a lot of people don't like this movie. That's why I love Star Trek Insurrection so much.
Mm-hmm.
I love that film because it is a classic Star Trek. It's an episode of Next Generation. That's
Yep.
all it is, and that's why I love that film so much. And to go back to a point as well, this movie has no starships shooting at each other. Well, except for V'ger blowing things up at the beginning, but there's none of that action that we get spoiled with, quite frankly, in Wrath of Khan. I mean, the battle sequences, which we'll get to next in our next podcast,
Mm-hmm.
um, are just so epic, bordering on beautiful, especially in the the battle of the Mutara Nebula. This is just a story. This is a true journey into something that they don't understand. It's a true journey of discovery that a lot of the rest of the movies get away from. And understandably so when you're having a movie, because you have 2.5 hours to rope people in, right? You
Right.
got to get them to stay with you. And here, like we both said, you're getting an episode of Star Trek to reestablish the franchise is what they were really looking to do, right?
Yeah.
This is your core group of people, and this is what we're going to move forward with. Hey, let's give you a quick reminder of who everyone is, and let's move on. The one thing I wrote down is you get this very, very, very fit, um, you know, William Shatner that comes in as Kirk, right? Striding along, cocky, confident, very sure of himself, bringing about that demeanor. And something I was thinking about today, certain people are born for certain roles, and there's no doubt. And
Oh, for
sometimes I want
sure.
to break away from or deny them. Bill Shatner's always going to be Captain Kirk. I don't care. Mark Hamill's always going to be Luke Skywalker.
Right.
That's it. I'm even going to say that to me, I can't see here. I mean, I can see Harrison Ford as various characters that he's played throughout the career. I mean, he's not just a Han Solo. To me, Kyle MacLachlan, who is from one of my favorite TV shows, Twin Peaks, he's always going to be Dale Cooper. Like that's it. He was born for that role. That's
Yep.
what you're seeing, I think, in this movie as well. That hey, I'm Kirk, and like that's what I was. This is what I was born to do. Screw
Yeah.
T.J. Hooker. I'm
Right.
I'm Captain Kirk.
I will say, like, William Shatner's done numerous other things that I really enjoy him in. Was that Boston Legal? Was it where he plays Denny
Yeah.
Crane? Oh my God, what a character! Like, I'll
Right.
never forget when he won his first case, and they looked at his notes, and it's just Denny Crane, Denny Crane, Denny Crane, Denny Crane.
Yeah.
It's just hilarious. So, I mean, he's got range. It's not to say that like he can't do other things, because I want because some people are like, well, he's Captain Kirk, and they don't take him seriously and other stuff. He's still great, but there is like, of the Kirks that have come and gone, let's say, and nothing against the modern Star Trek films, because I do enjoy them. This is just not Captain Kirk. I'm sorry, you're just not Captain Kirk. Like, you could be a different captain. I mean, I know it's a different timeline, different universe, but you know, I will say Zachary Quinto plays a pretty good Spock, but I'm sorry, Chris Pine as Captain Kirk just doesn't fly for me.
which,
Um,
which is why I think those movies struggled a little bit, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It's
Although they're wonderful. The graphics
yeah,
quality is amazing. The stories were compelling. It just wasn't Star Trek. Like
right.
that Star Trek. It was a different, new, alternative Star Trek, which was fine. I enjoyed it for what it was. But I have a tendency to be a little too positive and, you know, give things a pass, which is where I rope us back to the motion picture, because I do really enjoy this film despite its flaws. And it's funny, I was just thinking, you know, in the original version, the Klingons, when they're speaking in the beginning, there's no subtitles. You have no idea what they're saying. Um, and then in the
Oh,
director's cut, they add the subtitles. So now you know what they're saying, which has always blown my mind, because I think I have a
never thought
VHS
about that.
copy of it. And yeah, it's just weird. But anyway, the journey into V'ger, because there's really not, there's that whole weird sequence with the wormhole, but again, I think that's just more reestablishing Kirk, and like getting him to acknowledge his flaws and then overcome them, which I think is
Right.
important. But to me, that whole sequence is like this, just a way for them to bridge running into Spock. Basically, it didn't, like, as part of an episode where they cut to commercial, like that was
Yeah.
sort of the filler for the commercial break.
Right.
It was interesting. It was different and cool. And then of course you get the Ilea healing Chekhov sequence there. But the coolest thing is when they finally do get to V'ger, because when Spock gets there, he's just sort of cold and indifferent. He's returned to that very original Spock that we know from the original series. And like you said, that this movie is just a vessel to serve the purpose of reintroducing these people, and reestablishing the franchise as something that's popular. But getting to V'ger and figuring out how to send that reply signal, that friendship signal, how to get into the cloud, like that establishing shot is really cool when they're on the outside of that massive cloud, and they're all like, "Wow, the 12th power, power field. That's unbelievable. It's insane." And then they get into it, and then they're like traveling forward for, I don't know, the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
Uh, and
Yeah.
again, it gets back to these really drawn out, I mean, beautiful visuals. They're a little dated by our standards, of course, now, but like just stunningly gorgeous at the time. And the one big detractor is, like, I know it's supposed to be this massive, massive thing. And this is where I have a little bit of a problem with the director's cut, is when they finally do arrive at Earth later on in the movie, there's this weird looking computer animated ship, and it's like, well, where'd the cloud go? Why are they in a ship now? And that just didn't jive. It was a huge disconnect for me.
Yeah.
Um, and
I
that
agree.
was a problem I have with it. But what ends up going on inside there with, the Ilea probe and, um, building that sort of love story is quintessential TOS storytelling. And the thing is it flips Decker and Kirk. Kirk becomes the one with the love interest, and or is usually the one with love interest in the show, and
Right.
then Decker becomes the one sort of there, and it kind of builds to, of course, the inevitable conclusion. But that whole interaction there kind of I think it was almost service to the fans who knew the original series and knew that, Kirk lays the pipe.
Right.
It was just so interesting to see them remove him from that and make him the mature admiral that he's become.
Well,
Um,
it's funny though, when if you remember when Ilea first walks onto the deck, and I can't remember what he says to her, and she goes, it's on record that I'm celibate, or my celibacy status is on record," and walks right past him. I think that was also a nod to, he always would get the ladies, and this is
yeah,
one that he's not going to get. But then Decker, in the long run, is going to wind up establishing that, which was another reason why I think they did the wormhole piece, right, to show that Decker did know the ship better, even though this is a love of Kirk's and something that um, he wielded for 5 years in outer space. He doesn't know her that well, and he's got to get to know her again, in a sense. And I
yeah,
think that's what Decker was there for, right? To continue almost playing a little bit of a foil to Kirk, just a little
yeah.
bit,
Kind of like the Kirk
um,
anti-Kirk, not quite the mirror universe Kirk, but like just a different, younger version of the captain who's got his mojo, and Kirk's kind of getting it back, and it's a it's an interesting dynamic. And that's, I really think sci-fi movies these days kind of lack some of that subtlety. Is, well, first of all, they're not as established as Star Trek was even at the time, even though it had
Right.
kind of faded out of public memory. It just, it's something that you don't really see these days, is these like real subtle relationships that grow and change, and the foil between characters and how they're educating each other. And there's, Roddenberry was great at this, and like having these subtle lessons, these life lessons that he's trying to teach, about diversity, inclusion, and just sort of the unity of peoples despite their differences, especially in the eyes of V'ger, who sees them as an infestation. Um,
Yeah.
it's such an interesting message and interesting dynamic that they paint in this movie. And that was, again, an homage to the show. Like why I noticed it as one big long episode was the whole thing is kind of like all of the tropes. Well, we think of them now as tropes because it's Star Trek, the original series, you know, all of that is painted in this macrocosm way, instead of being that tight 30-minute time slot, they've got like what feels like 3 hours to fill. And so it gets blown up, but it's kind of like, and I'm going to draw a parallel to a Voyager episode when they run into the macro viruses, which are literally just giant viruses on a giant like insect scale. It's the same idea. Is they're taking that tiny part of the story they cram into 30 minutes and blowing it up into a quarter of the movie. Which I think it's really cool. It's like a little annoying as a modern viewer because you're not used to that slow build, but it feels really interesting to look at now.
Yeah, and I also have thought a lot about bringing Spock. Well, one of the other purposes of Spock, right, was almost to put him up against V'ger in a logical sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
This might be something. This entity, this V'ger, might actually be more mechanical and logical thinking than even Spock wants to be, or obsesses
Vulcans
to be,
want to be,
or
yeah.
longs to be, right? So here's V'ger that's outthinking him, again, probably the wrong word, just this idea of just flat out logic about what it's really seeking. And then in the process, Spock kind of figures it out as well. This idea and this purpose of logic, in a sense, right? Foregoing the Kolinar, and this winds up being, to me, this kind of winds up being his Kolinar test in the long run, is kind of figuring out what V'ger really wants and what it's really doing. And maybe, and if you really think about it, this just came to me now. V'ger gives into emotion at some point, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Decker and Ilani, I'm going to say her, I
Ilea.
always say her name, Ilea, they wind up merging, which it really winds up being an emotional thing. It's going to, Decker's emotions and Ilea's emotions come through. So even though there's all that logic there almost still seems to be some emotion that's still, deep beneath the surface.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, again, going back to the foil conversation, it's a foil of just all of the Vulcan philosophy.
Yeah,
And identifying, and I think the most telling line is when Spock says V'ger is a child, because V'ger is pure logic, kind of like Vulcans at one point were pure emotion, and then of
yeah,
course the split with the Romulans, they became more logical and they tried to repress their emotions. And what Spock, and through his later days when he's in the Next Generation and stuff, he's grown from that because he sees sort of the infancy of aspiring for the pure logic. Like V'ger is pure logic but still lacks something. It's empty, it's unfeeling. And then he recognizes that and is able to sort of snap back to it and grow to an adulthood where V'ger is now able to embark on sort of that adolescence period and merge with Decker. And it really is just it's sort of interesting because Voyager is still out there. The probe is still going. I've always wondered about like what is that going to end up doing at the end of its journey. If it ever does end, it may continue floating literally forever. We're still getting signals from deep space. And what I liked most about this movie is it had that connection to something real, because we learned about Voyager in school. Like it was a
yep,
big talking point.
yep,
And the purpose of it was to maybe one day run into alien life. And I've always wondered, like, you know, with V'ger in this universe, in this storytelling of Star Trek, and I know that there's fan fiction and there's some theories out there, but I grew up, of course, with the Next Generation as kind of my mainstay of Star Trek and the Borg, and I was thinking, well, maybe V'ger created the Borg, through V'ger's travels. Is this a direct result of V'ger or some sort of offspring of V'ger or a?
You got it. There, there's a book out there that Bill Shatner wrote. Have you ever read
Oh,
that book?
I haven't. I have not read
You,
many of the Star Trek
it,
books, so
you need. I'll try and when once we have our website up, I can list. I'll put a link out there for anyone who hasn't read the book yet. Bill Shatner writes a book that happens right after the movie Star Trek Generations, and what winds up happening is, spoiler alert, Kirk winds up getting revived by nanites, and but only has a certain amount of time to live. Long story short, V'ger creates the Borg, and I loved that. So there you go. But I love the story that he put out there because it's kind of like uh, we put this thing out there for good and put it out into space, hoping to contact something, and look at what it does to us. It totally
right.
backfires on us and comes after us in a sense. But I really love how he put that together. I'll try and find the name of the book for you. But he does a great job of telling the story that V'ger is the original Borg. You
Yeah,
know
that's
that.
awesome. That's a great. I feel cheated now because like I wish that was my idea.
Well, it
But
is
hey,
still in your head.
yeah, it was a cool moment for me, and I thought of it when I was a kid. So maybe
Yeah.
around that time the book had come out, and maybe I had heard about it, and that's who knows. I was a
Well, I
little
think
kid.
it's a logical assumption, though, right? Because
Yeah,
V'ger's going through the universe, acquiring things and adding it to its consciousness. I mean, that's how supposedly, right? And this is what the Borg does. That's how V'ger builds its massive structure, is by acquiring all these different pieces into it that it's come across with other civilizations and moving forward. Well,
hmm,
guess what? That's the Borg. I mean, it lines up exactly with the Borg.
yeah. I mean, you could also take it a step further and think, did V'ger, after its travels and after creating the Borg, let's say, did it become part of that android machine world that they talk about in Picard? Um, I mean, that to me is still an open ended thing that they could explore later. I'm just throwing it out there. But this is a
Right.
great time to drop. Our website is going to be coming up soon. And when you need a website, Lord Uther, who do you go to?
I'm immediately, without any pause, I go to Peak Media, the
Really?
premier web designer out there.
I've
Yes,
heard that they do fantastic work and are number one in our hearts and on the web.
that's right. And we'll be able to show that off very, very soon, right after we meet with them tomorrow, actually. That'll be in the process of getting all put together.
Heck yeah, can't
Fantastic.
wait. Can't wait. So, um, I think, now that we've kind of crossed the threshold of, we've gotten past the end of the movie and we're moving forward into that next phase of, the Enterprise reemerges, it's kind of the end of the show, and the what comes next aspect of it. For me, I had of course known that there were several movies that came after it, but leaving the theater from this movie, let's say, you got to think what's like Kirk has the Enterprise back. There's any number of things that could happen now. I mean, what as a fan, what would be going through your head if you were leaving that theater and this had just happened?
It's a great question, because obviously we do wind up, well, I think as a fan, I think there's two ways to look at it, right? Were they going to get some kind of a series back, which wasn't going to happen, and the hope is obviously there, and the setup is there for them to continue forward, with the franchise. I mean, I think that's probably what was going through most people's minds. I mean, the, what really winds up making this motion picture happen anyway, besides the success of sci-fi towards mid to late 70s, was they were doing Star Trek conventions all the way up to that point, and that's what really gets this to be put together and to really happen, is they know that the interest was still out there. um so I think as a fan, I'm hoping that they're going to stay together. When we get to one of the later Star Trek movies, I have some thoughts on one of the characters that I would have liked to have seen something happen. Um, and that, you know, they're able to continue the franchise moving forward. I mean, I guess that was my hope, and who would have known it would have spun off into Wrath of Khan the way it did. Still, probably the most known Star Trek movie that's really out there. Maybe First Contact is a close second because the action and the story from both of those movies were just so compelling.
Yeah,
But that's really, I think, how your everyday person knows Star Trek.
I think so too. And I think leaving the theater, you know, if you were a fan of the original series, you had to be really pleased with this movie in a lot of ways. Like, were there some issues? Yeah, but it's Star Trek and it's back a decade or so later. Like, you know, and there's the animated series. I think a lot of people forget kind of went on for a couple of years there, but
Yeah,
um, I think you have to come out of there with a lot of optimism. Like, what really is next, and where do you take this franchise from here? And I want to say, because our next episode, of course, is going to focus on Star Trek Two: The Wrath of Khan. Um, I really think that the unexpected success of the movie, you know, with its challenges, and I think some of the backlash from the movie because of what it was led right into why they took Wrath of Khan the way they did. Um, I also think that Khan is just such an iconic character. There's no way they couldn't revisit that. But I do think that I think with any start of a franchise movie, the sequel, you want to avoid a sophomore slump.
yeah,
You come out of Star Trek the motion picture thinking, all right, we need to, you know, not just kick up everything a notch, but raise the stakes quite a bit, and really build this in a way that's going to lay a foundation for, I think, the rest of the movies that come out. Because I don't think there was ever any specific number of movies they had committed to.
I agree.
So, it was like, if we're going to set up a franchise, let's lay some, because I just watched Wrath of Khan. So it's like watching them back to back, I can see where the first movie really doesn't set up Wrath of Khan.
Oh, not at
It,
all.
it puts a few things in place, and other than Kirk being in charge of the Enterprise now, in some sense, and being affiliated with it in some sense, that's about the only connection those two movies have. And what Star Trek 2 does really well, which we'll talk about next time, is setting up the later movies that become iconic to the series. Um, and I think that's where some people actually sort of forget that this movie exists. I think everybody sort of remembers the story, but I don't know if you get this way with other people who enjoy Star Trek, but when you ask them, about the Star Trek movies, they can usually tell you like about Star Trek 2 or Star Trek 4
Yeah.
or Generations or First Contact or maybe Nemesis. I mean, what, what are your experiences on that? Or what are your thoughts on how the first movie kind of fits with everything else?
Yeah, I think there's two things because just so our all of our millions and millions of listeners know, we're going to go through all the Star Trek original series movies first, and then go back and talk about the seasons of the original series. So now there's two things I'm really going to look for when I go back and watch the original series. One is I'm going to look very, very closely at the Kirk, Spock, McCoy dynamic because I feel like in the movies, and this is just going off, I feel like they played to the idea of Spock and McCoy being each other's foil more than maybe they did in the original series, but I'm really going to go back and look at that. The other thing I want to go back and look at is watch Space Seed and really see, was Khan that much of a villain then as he's portrayed in the Wrath of Khan? Or did Wrath of Khan help that get set up to make him really be this bad guy back in the original series?
Yeah.
So I'm going to be curious to go back and look at that.
I will say, having just watched Wrath of Khan, and I know I'm jumping to the next episode gun a little bit here, but I immediately think of Benedict Cumberbatch when I think of the
Oh,
original series
I'm so
episode.
sorry. Right.
I feel like
Oh, the
I
original series episode. Okay.
yeah, I feel like the original series and the Benedict Cumberbatch version of Khan are more closely related than the Khan that we see in Wrath of Khan. And we'll talk more when we get to the next
Yeah.
episode, and of course when we get to the series, we'll have, I'm sure, a lot to talk about there. But I've got really nothing else on this one, Uther. Or you got anything else for motion picture?
Yeah, I just think I think being older and going back and watching it again, I appreciate it a lot more because I think you really hit the nail on the head. It is the lambasted, forgotten movie out of all the Star Trek movies, where if we look at it historically and look at it being a little bit older and look at it with all this upgraded special effects and everything, it's really the start of something beautiful. I mean, it really helps the franchise move forward, especially during that time period. Though I really believe Wrath of Khan, pardon my pun here, like launches the series at warp speed um, into being something that will forever be ingrained in science fiction history. Right? There's always going to be Star Wars. There's always going to be Star Trek. That's it.
Definitely, yeah. And I think something that we need to remember about the motion picture, because I think this is probably going to be the briefest episode on the Star Trek movies,
Right.
but
That's fair.
with good reason, because it's just an extended Star Trek episode, but it does reignite the passion and vigor of the original series. And that is, again, laying that foundation and bringing in the possibility of the Wrath of Khan in the movies that come after. So, yeah, like you said, it's lambasted, it's forgotten, but it really is like a key. It's a turnkey moment for Star Trek. It directly leads you into the next generation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not just with the music, but like um, with the concept of a new Enterprise and a new captain. Because, to that point, the only other captain of the Enterprise we've seen is Captain Pike. Now we get Captain Decker, and it's like, yeah, at some point, Kirk lets go of the Enterprise, one way or another, whether it's from promotion that we don't see on screen,
Right.
or later on, through retirement or, eventually death. But that it's such a big, like component. It's the keystone of bridging the original series with everything else that happens in the Star Trek universe. And I do think I appreciate it more now as well, because I can see it as it's intended to be. And I think the reason they made it the way it was at the time is because if it ended up being the only movie they ever did, it's a standalone film that works. I mean,
Right.
it was never going to be the greatest sci-fi movie ever, but it's something that they could all hang their hat on and be proud of as a complete story. Because we certainly see movies that set up future sequels that never get made,
Yep.
rightly or wrongly so. And that's just, to me, that's a really cool thing that now these days, in this mindset, in this time frame, we can look on it and have more rose tinted glasses than I think even 30 years ago. When the Next Generation movies were coming out, I think a lot of people would have looked back on this movie and been like, it's kind of crap.
Yep.
So we're very fortunate. So,
I agree 100%. One
but
one, one last piece, and then I'll let you take us out. Um, Jerry Gold. I think the soundtrack for motion picture is one of the best, but then again, Jerry Goldsmith is one of the best. Just like John Williams is one of the best, and Hans Zimmer is one of the best. I mean, those are your best movie composers, probably, and Danny Elfman that are out there. But he really shines, and I really think he also helps to drive the movie because of his incredible musical talent at composing
definitely,
these scores.
absolutely. And I think that's, like we've talked on the Digital Escape podcast many times. That's what the ties that bind are a lot of the times in media, whether it's video games or movies or TV. If there's a great theme song or great backing music, you remember it. You remember it very well. Like we all got introduced to classical music through Bugs Bunny. We all got
Yeah,
introduced to, Gary Portnoy with Cheers. Like it's just,
right.
I mean, it's just amazing the stuff you see, and remember, somebody plays you a theme song from a show and you're like, oh, right, that's from XYZ, or what have
Yeah.
you. So, hats off to the entire motion picture crew, because that movie really has, I think, captivated generations of Star Trek people to come. Like,
Right.
I think the reason that people keep going back to the same universe, the same brand of characters, really has a lot to do with this movie. Not only did it re-energize the franchise, but it gave us the opportunity to take Star Trek to a next generation, to a new
Yeah.
quadrant of the universe, to deep space, back in time, and to a new land of discovery, and other catchphrase relating to a Star Trek
Right.
show. But with that, this is the Warp Core, and we are moving ahead, Warp Factor 9, because we are
Ooh.
taking it out from here. Lord Uther, I thank you for your time. I am Urza Master. You can follow us on Podbean, on YouTube, on Stitcher, on Google Podcasts, and of course, we're also available on Pandora and potentially coming soon Spotify. Check us out at Facebook. We are Digital Escape Podcast, where you can find all things Warp Core Podcast and Digital Escape Podcast. You can follow me, Urza Master, on Facebook, and Lord Uther on
I'm
Twitch.
working on it.
And he's working on it. How's he going to follow that? I don't
Working
know.
on
We'll find
Facebook.
out. We have gone where no Digital Escape Podcast members have gone before, Lord Uther.
Love it. Love it.
With that, our continuing journey will come up next with the Wrath of Khan.